She walked past the $75,000 Steinway without slowing down. Arthur Kessler had been watching her from the moment she came through the door. Hat pulled low, oversized coat, no assistant, no one carrying bags, no one holding a phone out to capture the moment. He hadn't recognized her. What he registered was a woman who moved like she was practicing not being noticed. That was December 1993, 2 weeks before Christmas. Manhattan was the kind of cold that settles into your coat and stops being weather and starts being a mood. She had been on every magazine cover for the better part of a year. The Bodyguard had crossed $400 million at the box office. I Will Always Love You had been at #1 for so long that radio programmers had quietly stopped updating the chart position. But she wasn't in Kessler's Music and Antiques on West 46th Street as Whitney Houston. She was there as someone who needed to find a Christmas gift for her mother, and that was all she wanted to be for one afternoon. Sissy Houston had played gospel piano since before Whitney could form words. Not the polished kind of gospel that ends up on compilations. The raw kind, where the feeling leads and the theory follows if it can keep up. Whitney had been trying to find something for her mother that wasn't a coat or a piece of jewelry in a box. She wanted something that meant something. A friend had mentioned Kessler's, an old place near the music publishing houses. Arthur looked up when she walked in, looked back down, and kept writing his appraisal notes. He was working on a 1920s Steinway baby grand that had come in the previous week. He'd already had 2 serious inquiries. He let her wander. She moved through the front section without urgency, glanced at a framed photograph of Fats Domino on the wall, past the mahogany upright with the hand-painted medallion inlay. She wasn't browsing the way people browse when they have no idea what they want. She was moving like someone who does know but hasn't found it yet, which is a different thing entirely. Then she stopped. Not at the Steinway. She stopped at the back of the shop, the part where the overhead light didn't quite reach. Arthur kept his consignment pieces back there, instruments in various states of wear waiting to be bundled into a bulk lot at the end of a contract window. The rest of the shop was a showroom. That corner was a waiting room. She crouched down. Bottom shelf, half hidden behind a flat box of old sheet music, was a short upright piano. The wood had faded from whatever its original color was to something between brown and gray. A strip of masking tape on the top held a handwritten price, $450. The handwriting wasn't Arthur's. She pressed one key. The sound that came out was slightly off, not broken, tired the way a voice sounds at the end of a long day. She pressed 3 more keys, slowly, listening to each one decay before moving to the next. Arthur came around the counter. "That's just a consignment piece," he said. "The owner brought it in 2 months ago. Contract expires Friday. Nobody's asked about it. I've got a Steinway baby grand over here that just came out of a full restoration if you're looking for—" She wasn't listening. She had lifted the fallboard and was looking at the keys. Some of the ivory had yellowed. One key had a small chip at the corner. Her left hand found a cord. Her right hand found a note above it. Arthur stopped talking. She didn't play anything he recognized right away. She played the way people do when they're testing whether a room has an echo, more listening than playing. Her hands were quiet on the keys, but the tone that came out of that old box was not quiet. It was full in a way that didn't match the instrument's size. 70 years of a certain kind of stillness had done something to the wood, and what it had done couldn't be bought or restored or replicated. It could only be waited for. She closed her eyes. And then, without setting up to do it, she sang, not loudly, nearly to herself. "His eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." 2 lines, barely above a whisper. But in that back room with no microphone and no reverb, those 2 lines moved through the air like something physical. Arthur did not move. He was 61 years old. He had been in music his whole life and in this shop for 22 years. But he had never stood 6 feet from a voice like that and felt it the way you feel a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Not heard it. Felt it. She stopped, opened her eyes, looked at the piano. The door opened. Arthur turned. An old man, 70s, dark coat, careful steps. He held the door handle a beat longer than necessary after coming through, making sure it didn't slam. His name was Clarence Webb, and Arthur knew him. He was the one who had brought the piano in. Clarence Webb had been director of music at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark for 31 years. He had retired or been eased out, depending on who was telling it, 4 years ago when the church modernized its music program, and the new pastor had a different vision for what Sunday mornings should sound like. Clarence had kept giving lessons out of his apartment, picking up work for other churches when it came. But his health insurance ran out in the spring, and by October, his savings were close enough to empty that he'd signed a 60-day consignment contract for the piano. He'd been coming in every 2 weeks, always near the end of the day, always alone. "Mr. Webb," Arthur said, "you're a little early this week." Clarence nodded. His eyes had found the woman at the piano. She had turned to look at him. "Is this your piano?" she asked. "It is." He came a few steps closer. "I tuned it last week, or tried to. The C above middle has a third string that's been stubborn for years. I know it's not much to look at." She shook her head. "Where did it come from?" Clarence's hands were in his coat pockets, but something in his posture shifted, the way it does when someone asks about a thing that has weight. "New Hope Baptist, Newark. They replaced it in 1971 with a newer model. I bought it from the church for $60 because I couldn't stand to see it go. That's where I learned everything I know. That piano is how I learned it." A beat passed. "New Hope," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Whitney Houston sang at New Hope. Clarence looked at her then. The hat, the coat, the eyes. His mouth opened slightly and stayed that way. "She's my mother," Whitney said. The shop went quiet. Outside, a taxi on 46th Street. Inside, nothing. Clarence Webb had spent 31 years directing music at New Hope Baptist. He had sat at that bench while Whitney Houston stood behind him and sang. He remembered the first time he heard the daughter sing at a Sunday service in the late 1960s. She was 7, maybe 8. She stood up, and people turned around in their pews. His hands came out of his pockets. They were not steady. "I opened the lid once," he said, "a long time ago. I wrote something on the inside. My wife always told me not to write on things that didn't belong to me, but I did it anyway." Whitney turned back to the piano. She lifted the fallboard all the way and raised the lid above the keys and looked at the old wood framing inside. And there, on the inner surface of the lid, written in pencil that had faded but not disappeared, was a single line. "For the children who haven't found their voice yet." She stood still for a moment. Arthur, across the room, had not moved in several minutes. He was looking at the two of them and not saying anything, which was not something that came naturally to him. She turned to Clarence. "How much do you owe?" Clarence looked at the floor. "I'm not asking to be generous," she said. "I'm asking because I want to understand what's happening here." He told her. Months of missed rent on his workshop space, medical bills he'd been paying down in installments, the kind of numbers that are manageable to some people and unsurvivable to others, depending entirely on which side of a line you happen to be standing on. She nodded once. Then she turned to Arthur. "I'd like to buy this piano." Arthur opened his mouth. "Of course. The price on the tag?" "I don't care about the price on the tag." She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and placed a card on the counter. "And I'd like it delivered, but not to my address." She looked at Clarence. "There's a children's music program at a church in Harlem. They've been using a keyboard with 3 broken keys for 2 years because they can't afford a replacement. I want this piano to go there." She paused. "And I want to know if you'd be willing to teach there. Not as a favor, as a job." Clarence Webb stood very still. "Mr. Webb," she said, and her voice had something in it that didn't belong on a recording, the thing that doesn't transfer when you hold a microphone up to a person. "You wrote on that piano that it was for the children who hadn't found their voice yet. I grew up 10 minutes from New Hope. I sang in a church just like yours. I was one of those children. This piano should be doing what it was built to do." Clarence's jaw moved. He was holding something together and not quite making it. Arthur looked down at the card on his counter. Whitney E. Houston. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the appraisal notes he'd been writing. He had moved instruments into penthouses for people who, as far as he could tell, had no real interest in playing them. He thought about the form Clarence Webb had filled out in October. Name, address, description of instrument. Arthur had taken the form, written a price on a piece of tape, and put the piano in the back without once looking at it. He had never asked Clarence Webb what the piano meant. He pressed both hands flat on the counter, his chin dropped toward his chest. 2 months, he said very quietly. 2 months and I never touched that piano. Never asked what it was. Never asked him anything. No one answered him. There was nothing useful to say. 3 months later, the piano arrived at the church in Harlem. Clarence Webb drove up with the movers and helped carry it through the side entrance. He sat down at the bench and played a chord, and the sound rose through the old wood and filled the fellowship hall. A kid in the back, 8 years old, had been sitting on the floor not paying attention. He stopped, looked up, and stared at the ceiling like the sound had come from somewhere above him. Clarence started teaching on a Tuesday. Within a year, 14 children were in the program. Within 3 years, there was a waiting list. Arthur Kessler made one change to how he ran the shop. He started talking to the people who brought instruments in, not just taking the paperwork, asking where the things came from and what they meant. It made everything take longer. He did not stop doing it. Whitney never mentioned the piano in an interview. There was no announcement. It was a Tuesday afternoon in December, and she had gone looking for a gift for her mother and found something else instead. The piano with the pencil line on the inside of the lid sat in that Harlem Fellowship Hall for years. A lot of children touched those keys. Some of them could really play. None of them knew whose hands had been on those keys before theirs. But the sound was the same. Full, deep, old wood sound. The kind that doesn't care what key you start in, because the feeling gets there first and the notes just follow. Exactly the way Whitney Houston used to explain it. Exactly the way her daughter always understood it, even before she had the words for it. Have you ever walked into a room looking for one thing and walked out with something you didn't know you needed? Tell us what that was in the comments. And if you want to know more about the Whitney Houston that never made the front page, stay with us.